introduce Professor Richard King. Professor Richard King is originally from Britain. He's born in Marlborough, which is not far away from the place I speak now. And he's a graduate from Christ Church College at Oxford in 1984. He studied further in Berlin and at Cambridge. He worked in Germany and Scotland. And now Professor Richard King is Professor Ordinarius with focus on history of philosophy at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And among his publications, I'd like to mention and encourage the audience to read Aristotle on Life and Death, Aristotle on Plotinus on Memory, published in 2009, and other comparative works such as The Good Life and Conceptions of Life in Early China and Greco-Roman Antiquity. I am actually very delighted to see a serious classicist, an important classicist with an interest in the history of philosophy and also with a sympathetic view on comparative philosophy or comparative reflection, to put it best. So I'll hand out the microphone to Professor Richard King. Welcome.
Many thanks, Ionut, for this very kind introduction, and many thanks for the invitation to speak here. So I will share my screen with you so you can, as it were, read as well as listen in the hope that things will be clearer like that. I'm going to talk about the axial age and the problem of universals. What I'm going to do is to focus on something which seems very straightforward and very attractive, but I'm afraid is much more difficult than it appears and much less attractive than it appears. I think that if we look at Karl Jasper's book, The Origin and Goal of History, written at a period when Europe was largely destroyed by nationalism, and a period which also saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in New York, we see someone looking for what is common to humans, all humans, to provide all humans with a common future, as he put it. And of course, the problem is, what is he looking for really when he looks for something universal? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at two thinkers very briefly, Mencius and Aristotle, zoom in, as perhaps appropriate on Zoom, on a couple of texts and actually question whether we really can call these texts universal. There are limits to the extent to which nature, in both Mencius and Aristotle in a way, and rights in the Mencius and laws in Aristotle are universal. I think that this is a spurious universality. And of course, there is a strong supposition that universals in practical philosophy are really our concern. I mean, this is shown by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as Chris Gill, who taught and teaches, as far as I know, in Exeter, where Ionut is, pointed out some time ago in a very useful article about the role of universals in ancient philosophy. They play a very different role to what we expect. We, who are burdened with Kant and the idea that in some sense, the norms we use must be universal. And I think antiquity is very different. It is not just Kant, but unclear Kant. One person who has tried to look at the role of universals in early Chinese philosophy or in Confucianism is Heinrichs. And what he tried to do was to claim that Confucian ethics is universal. And what he means by universal is taken from the American psychologist Lawrence Koberg, who divided up human development, of course, orientated largely on American American youth and the way they grow up and where they end up, if they're good children, is they end up with the universal ethical principle orientation, a long mouthful. The right is what is in accordance. This is the way Rutz gives Koberg. The right is what is in accordance with abstract, consistent, and universally valid principles. It is based on the autonomous decision of conscience. Now, this sounds very, very Western, modern, and there are many points we could home in on in this quotation to question what is happening. What I want to do is give you a very famous little bit of Mencius. So in the famous story of the child crawling towards the well, Mencius hopes to show what it means that we all have a heart that does not bear the suffering of others. And this is what the way this very famous text begins, and on which I've written before. So what this text tells us is that the earlier kings, so the earlier kings of what is now China and was in the Mencius called the Xia domains, had a heart which did not bear the suffering of others, and therefore they had a government which did not bear the suffering of others. Now, this sounds perfect. This sounds universal. This is the way all humans are. And in fact, there are other quotations which one can give from the Mencius which go in the same direction. Perhaps one of the most famous of all quotations from the Mencius, Renier, so which I would translate as being humane, Ren, is being human. And when joined together, he goes on, it is called the path of duty. And this is a play on words, much as it is in English. Being humane is being human. In the modern pronunciation, both are Ren, and they are perhaps also etymologically connected. So this sounds perfect. You know, this is, as it were, the core of what it is to be human is to be humane. Another translation for this word Ren, meaning humane, is benevolence. And it may also have overtones of actually being perfectly virtuous. But things, in fact, are rather more complicated than this. And one is the ambiguity in the Chinese word, or the old Chinese word Ren. It can be used to mean human, that is certainly true, but it also tends to mean nobles. And it can also simply serve as an indication of others as well. Now, the first quotation that I gave, which is about a government that cannot bear the suffering of others, makes quite clear that what we're talking about here really is a small elite who run the government. And in fact, the text goes on, as I'm sure some people will remember, that some people will be excluded from being Ren if they don't have the right hearts. In other words, the right kind of virtuous inclinations developed into proper virtues. And so you exclude them from being Ren. Now, either you exclude them from being human, which I think is something that we would find very worrying, or else you just demote them from being noble. You just make them into people like everyone else who are subject to the ruler. Now, of course, what Mencius did was he advised rulers, kings and other rulers, as well as people in a similar position to himself. And his addressees are very, very limited. Now, of course, he is not the only early philosopher of whom this is true. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is the norm. And also the connection with ruling is also extremely important for early philosophers. So I mentioned earlier the Greeks who went to Rome in the 1st century BC. Philosophers do have a terrible tendency to follow the money or follow the ruler and find a ruler to look after them and whom they can then advise. Now, another aspect in the Mencius, which is at the center of many readings of Mencius is Xing, so which is translated usually as nature, and is said by a very great authority, A.C. Graham, to be one of the terms which does have an analog in Greek, namely physis. And both of them, of course, are connected with the idea of growing. And the importance of this for Mencius is enormous, because in the traditional reading of Mencius, which is an important restriction, his most important saying is Xinshang, namely that your nature is good. And of course, when we turn to Aristotle, it looks as though there is also a similarly universal assertion about all humans, namely that we all are living things with reason, and furthermore, that we naturally live in cities. So we are politikon zoon on the one hand, and we are a zoon logon echon on the other hand. And of course, Aristotle is also someone who advised rulers. Now, the problem with this as a basis for universality is that, in fact, Mencius is really interested not just in the fact that we are basically good, will develop to be good if allowed to. What we really need to know is the concrete behavior that will arise from this. And this is determined, as I suppose is very well known, by rights, Li. Now, the way these are spelt out by Mencius, and I think for the first time in Chinese history, is according to the relations among humans. Now, these, of course, are very various, and they are also rather restricted. I mean, there are many more relations among humans than those listed here. And in fact, of course, these relations have three purposes in Mencius. They distinguish the way in which humans differ from beasts and birds. They distinguish the xia, which is Mencius's name, as it were, for his group from others. And it also distinguishes the junzi, the lords and princes, from their subjects. And these boundaries are completely fixed, I think, in the Mencius. Mencius is not really interested in what everyone does. And the same point, I think, can be made in Aristotle. And this will worry my philosophy colleagues who are used to reading Aristotle as though he were a fellow philosopher whose office is down the hall. And Aristotle, like Mencius, is talking to elite males, potential rulers of cities, and these cities are, of course, famously, infamously based on slavery. And these cities are hierarchical, and they are carried out, they are supported on the backs of natural slaves. Now, Aristotle is famous, perhaps above all, through Thomas Aquinas, for his support of the idea of natural law. As he says, just as fire always goes up here and everywhere, so too there are things which are nomos, law among the Persians, just as in Athens, but it doesn't really play very much of a role in his own deliberations. What does play a role is his idea that there is a single best politeia, a single best constitution, as we translate that usually. But Aristotle is not trying to, as it were, colonize the whole world and turn it into a huge number of Greek polis. He does not think that his duty is to universalize everything. Now, another very famous argument in Aristotle says that we all have a function, an ergon. And what this ergon is a rational activity, a rational activity following virtue. And yet, when we actually look at the politics, we see that only the ruler, in fact, possesses phronesis. so that rationality is spread out in a very differential way among humans. This is something that Dominic Scott has emphasized in his most recent book on the Republic and the Ethics, on Plato's Republic and the Ethics. And it's not a right shared by all, only a potential that we all have, but it may be developed into practical wisdom, but need not be. And one final point, there seems to be natural hierarchy in Aristotle, as indeed there is, I think, in early Chinese thought. All relationships are based on hierarchy, and even those relationships which may not be hierarchical are within the hierarchy. So if you're on the same level as someone else, your relationship may not be hierarchical, but you're within a hierarchy. And this is based on the fact, Aristotle claims in the Politics, that throughout nature there is a hierarchy. His main witness, of course, is the relation between the body and the soul. The soul rules, the body obeys. Now, if we were actually trying to derive anything from this hierarchy, we have to do an awful lot of what I would call specification. We would have to break this down and to explain on a way that nature does not prescribe just how these hierarchies arise. And of course, Aristotle does an awful lot of arguing about the kind of hierarchies that there must be in the city. His use of nature is suggestive rather than demonstrative, I think. So I'm not quite sure when we began, but I will now finish off like a good boy, I think, on time. Just saying that, I mean, practical thought is practical in antiquity, at least we hope so. And of course, the problems that Mencius and Aristotle were trying to solve were not ours, were not, for example, the climate crisis. And they're universals, which they do have. They are not really the kind that we need. And we need to think about the way in which Aristotelian and indeed Mencian universals function within their own work, and how they differ in that from the way our universals function in our practical ethics. And so, in a way, what I would encourage the comparative philosopher to do is to let the text speak rather than imposing our problems on them. I mean, one of the great delights of philosophy is its uselessness. And harnessing it to our concerns seems to be a very violent and unfortunate thing to do. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing these problems with you. My final slide has some of the things I've referred to in the course of, or haven't referred to, but you might have seen on my slides. Many thanks.